Hello, my name's Stuart. I'm the curator of the Cromwell Museum in Huntingdon. It's a pleasure to be here with you again this afternoon, recording another one of our Cromwellian conversations. It's the first one we've done for a little while, simply because we've been busy over the last few weeks since the museum reopened after the lockdown in the UK with the coronavirus pandemic. The museum is open again at the moment, so if you've got the opportunity, please do come and visit us. But today I'm going to talk a little bit about the subject of our current temporary exhibition, which is events that took place in Huntingdon 375 years ago during the civil wars in this country. And this is the so-called Battle of Huntingdon that took place in August 1645. Now, I say so-called battle, for you'll see why and reasons in a moment. But even though this is a very small action that probably nobody will, or very few people will have heard of from the Civil War period, it's quite a good example of what happened in individual communities right up and down the British Isles in this period, and the impact that civil wars would have actually have had on communities right across the country. So we're going back, as I say, to 1645, and in June 1645, Parliament had won a huge victory at the Battle of Naseby in Northamptonshire. Here, the King's forces, under the command of King Charles himself, on the 14th of June, faced off against Parliament's newly formed new modelled army, commanded by Sir Thomas Fairfax, with Oliver Cromwell in charge of Parliament's cavalry. The battle had proved to be a resounding and indeed, with hindsight, decisive victory for Parliament. Not only were most of the King's infantry killed, wounded, or in the vast majority of cases captured by the parliamentarians, but also the King's baggage train had been captured, including his private correspondence. This included many of his private letters, which were published with a great deal of glee by the parliamentarians, some of which they used for propaganda purposes to show that the king had been negotiating with foreign powers. After winning the battle, Parliament's army then headed south into the southwest of England, with the intention of mopping up the Royalist forces there, and more particularly besieging the great port city of Bristol, which was still held by the Royalists at this stage. So Fairfax and Cromwell were located down in the southwest at this time. After Naseby, the king escaped with some of his cavalry. He went to Leicester in the first instance, and then moved over to Wales to try and recruit more soldiers. And from there, the king intended to head north into Scotland, where he wanted to link up with the victorious Royalist forces there under the Marquis of Montrose. However, as he headed north, he found his route blocked by the parliamentarians in Yorkshire, commanded by the wonderfully named Sydenham Points. As a result of which, the king was forced to turn south with his cavalry, back down the Great North Road, with the intention of heading back to the Royalist capital at Oxford. And it's here, of course, that he would have to pass through Huntingdon. Now, the king had with him perhaps somewhere in the region of 2,500, maybe 3,500 troops, nearly all cavalry, all veteran troops, so horsemen that were heading south down the Great North Road, what is today the modern day A1. On the 24th of August 1645, they passed through the village of Stilton, which is sort of midway between Peterborough and Huntingdon. And yes, it is that Stilton, by the way. It's the village which gave its name to the famous blue-veined cheese, which would start to become famous about 50 years later, into the early 1700s. Here the king's forces encountered a force of 300 or 400 men, local cavalry and possibly dragoons, mounted infantry from the Eastern Association, Parliament's forces in the east of England. Of course, being vastly more experienced and of course also having much greater numbers, the Royalists easily swept these parliamentarian troops aside. They then advanced on Huntingdon, where there was a brief battle for the town, termed the Battle of Huntingdon, but that's probably glamorising it with a far too great a title. Parliamentarians probably had a garrison of only a couple of hundred men, local infantry, gathered together here under the command of Captain Bennett. There were little in the way of defences for the town. Huntingdon at that stage was an average-sized market town. It was indeed the county town for Huntingdonshire. It had a population, we estimate, of around about 12 or 1,300 people. It sounds tiny in today's terms, but of course in the 17th century, the population of Britain was much, much smaller than today, and so it would have been a kind of moderate-sized market town. On the north side of the town was the town ditch. Now, sections of this do still survive today. There's a kind of drainage ditch, also would have been cluttered up with all sorts of waste as well that went around the town, going back to the Middle Ages. The parliamentarians had used this to sort of dig up earthworks and create some sort of at least temporary defences on the north side of the town, although generally most of Huntingdon's defences are on the south side, as they always expected to be attacked from the south and the Royalists at Oxford. So therefore, they had very little defences against the King's forces when they came against the town on the afternoon of the 24th of August. There was a brief fighting on the north side of the town. The Parliamentarian newsbook claimed that the Parliamentarian garrison fought very bravely as long as they were able. But a Royalist officer by the name of Richard Symonds, who leaves us an account of this period, said that the Parliamentarians were at a little disputed Huntingdon. We entered, notwithstanding a large ditch that encompassed the town and a breastwork and gate in the road. He claims that the Parliamentarians simply ran away to Cambridge. Certainly Captain Bennett and one or two of the other parliamentarians were killed in the fighting, and about 100 of them seem to have been taken prisoner. After securing the town for the king himself entered Huntingdon. He was greeted by the mayor and also two of the bailiffs, the senior figures of the town of Godmanchester, just the other side of the river. Now, this may have been good form, whether or not they just wanted to welcome the king because it was considered to be good form to do so, or whether they themselves were royalist in sympathy, we simply don't know. Like most places across the country, even though Huntingdon was nominally parliamentarian in sympathy, the community was divided, and there were lots of people locally who were royalist in sympathy, and the mayor may have been amongst those. They presented the king with some money, and basically some taxes raised in the town, with which they hoped he would be satisfied and would go away without therefore plundering Huntingdon or causing any significant damage, which the king promised to do so. The king himself established his headquarters at the George Hotel, which still survives today, and indeed the inner courtyard, the old coachyard, has little changed since this time. While staying in Huntingdon over the next 48 hours, the king learned about a great victory won by the Marquis of Montrose in Scotland at the Battle of Kilsyth. He also wrote an interesting letter, a text of which still survives today, to his military secretary, Edmund Walker, who was based at Oxford. And in this letter, the king continued to set down his thoughts and his adherence to his policy of divine right of kings and the sort of supremacy of the monarchy, as it were. He said in his letter that he did not wish to injure his successors by lessening the crown of that ecclesiastical and military power which his predecessors left him. Now, even though the king, of course, had given promises not to plunder the town of Huntingdon, that was going to be a little bit more difficult to deliver in practical terms. Soldiers during the Civil War of both sides were quite used to helping themselves to things when they were garrisoned on towns, particularly enemy ones. It's interesting, even late on in the Civil War, into the late 1640s, you had movements like the Levellers and the Parliamentarian forces. One of the demands of the Levellers is that they get immunity, indemnity against prosecution for any crimes they might have committed during the Civil War. And I think things like this, plunder and so on. Even so, it's worth saying that the Royalist forces did have a particular reputation for this sort of thing, or at least the Parliamentarian newsbooks would have you believe that, things like the cruelties of the Cavaliers. Now, it must have been a huge impact on the town, probably, say, 3,000 Royalist troops being billeted on the town of maybe 12 or 1,300 people. It was claimed by one newsbook at the town that all the households, though never so poor, had 20 or 30 in a house. So, having to suddenly feed, clothe, and generally look after these men, and of course all their horses as well into the bargain, must have caused absolute chaos in the place. Some of the households were taxed. Money was extracted with menaces from those who refused to pay, particularly targeting any of those who were known of parliamentarian sympathies. You have Memesian's collections, original parliamentarian newsbook, so you need to be a little bit careful in terms of, obviously, there's a level of bias here and whether or not exaggeration for propaganda purposes. This Royal Entertainment of Huntingdon claims there's one local man by the name of John Robbins from Godmanchester, who was 73 years old. The Royalists demanded him paying up £300 in order to support their war effort. When he refused, he was hung up by his wrists, put in stress positions, had burning match cord placed behind his ears, behind his hands, and over his face. Eventually, he was marched off as one of several hostages when the Royalists left the town a day later. Now, by now, the news had reached the Eastern Association of what was happening in Huntingdon. and Parliament forces were gathering together in order to repulse the Royalist threat. Of course, the Royalists realised this and moved on the 25th of August before they could kind of gather together. On this occasion, a couple of the Royalists accused of looting were quickly tried, and one of them found guilty and hung out on the town square as a sop to the locals. However, several of the local people were also taken away as hostages, ironically including the mayor of the town, the man who'd been obviously so keen to try and please the king when he'd arrived. The Parliamentarian Newsbook commented that the Royalists had been more like devils that come out of hell than any sort of men in the way they'd been behaved. Again, you can imagine for a little bit of exaggeration. But it's worth saying that a commentator coming through Huntingdon in 1663 described the town as a poor, decayed town, being on a busy road, was greatly impoverished by the insolences of armies and free quarters during the late wars. Local tradition has it that the Royalists caused so much damage in the town that two of the parish churches, those of St John and St Benedict, had to be pulled down. It's almost certainly not the case. In actual fact, we know that these churches were in a bad state of repair before the Civil War, most likely because they had declining congregations and simply couldn't support themselves and their repairs anymore. But it's interesting how these local traditions develop. That, of course, it must be damaged from the Civil War by the other side. So you can see the kind of level of impact on just one small community by an army during the Civil War. And this must have been replicated right across the country by towns that were sympathetic with one or both sides in this period. And imagine how, as I say, the world must have been simply turned upside down, to use the common phrase, as people's experience of this bloody and turbulent period. So I hope you found that interesting. Please do like this video and follow us on YouTube. Please also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. You'll find details in the card just at the end of this. And if you feel able to do so, then you can also donate to the museum as well. We are now open again with our coronavirus precautions in place. So you can, please do come and visit us. And we look forward to seeing you in one way or another very soon. Please do stay safe in the meantime. Thank you.